Welcome to the Holiday Podcast, where we usually sit over some fresh baked challah bread on Friday afternoons here at my dining room table. I'm your host, Tammy Priest, a Jewish follower of Jesus, and it's great to be with you again this week as we take another look at the intersection of the old and the new. Now, you probably caught that I said usually in my intro today because yes, we usually sit here and talk over some challah bread on Friday afternoons, but we're in the middle of Passover. So today we're sitting over some fresh baked matzo, unleavened bread. Matzah is actually really quick and easy, especially compared to challah bread. 4 ingredients, under 20 minutes, which is much faster than the 4-hour process for making challah. If you ever want to give it a try, there's a 30-second tutorial on my Instagram and YouTube. But anyway, since we're sitting here with matzah, I wanted to talk for a few minutes about that moment at the Last Supper when Jesus broke his unleavened bread, because there's so many layers of meaning in that moment. And I think that today, on Good Friday, the anniversary of when Jesus became that broken bread, it's a really good thing for us to talk about. So during the Passover Seder, which is what Jesus's Last Supper was, the worship guide asks a rhetorical question: what is matzah? And then the group retells God's description and instructions about this unleavened bread. And I'll read some of that to you from Exodus 12. With the dough they had brought from Egypt, they baked cakes of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. And God says, "For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread." So, as you know, especially those of you who started baking bread during the pandemic, yeast makes bread rise and puff up with air. So yeast became this biblical symbol of sin, all those things that lead us to puff ourselves up instead of viewing ourselves with biblical humility. So in so many ways, clearly, the absence of yeast in this bread speaks to Jesus's completely sinless life and the way he humbled himself, even to come live here wrapped in human mortality. But there's much more to it, which you start to realize as the Passover worship moves to the name of this unleavened bread. In Exodus, God actually names this unleavened bread. He called it the bread of affliction. And he called it that because of the suffering and the poverty endured by his people in Egypt. Now, of course, on this side of the Last Supper and the cross, we can see that it's also a picture of the suffering and poverty endured by Jesus during his life here on earth. And he left his heavenly throne. He put on humble human flesh, and he was afflicted in order to deliver us from bondage to sin and to brokenness and to death. And you've probably noticed before that these perforations in the matzah, see that? Those lines in the boxed kind, you can see lots of lines there. They're now made with a machine, and I used a fork. But these perforated stripes used to be made by hand with what people actually called matzah piercers, which is an incredibly vivid description of the wounds that Jesus endured for us in his body. Isaiah prophesied he was pierced for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. Knowing all we know about Jesus' life and what was to happen to him on Good Friday, this little piece of bread preaches a sermon about the Messiah, But Jesus preached his own sermon about this bread of affliction during the Last Supper, his own prophesying to the disciples, because during the Seder, the head of the table, which would have been Jesus in that upper room, lifts the matzah and blesses it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And then, as is the ritual, and has been the ritual since before Jesus, the leader breaks this bread of affliction and gives a piece to each person at the table to eat. You know, Luke tells us he took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it, saying to them, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So it had made perfect sense to the disciples after feeding the 5,000 that Jesus had pronounced he was the bread of life. But now in that upper room, the bread of abundant life had broken this bread of affliction and said that this was his body, broken for them, broken for us. And I have to imagine that the disciples' heads were spinning because this was not the ritual and it didn't make any sense. Of course, looking back, it would make perfect sense to them. Jesus really was literally broken the next day and poured out. And so today on Good Friday, I think something that's really powerful to think about is that when Jesus broke that bread at the Last Supper during his Passover meal, he knew exactly what was coming. He wasn't just instituting a communion ritual, he was, as God incarnate who lives outside of time, looking clearly at the cross. Even as the disciples were just sitting there gathered around the table, he could see it. And so the fact that he could break that bread of affliction, and give thanks for it, it's astounding to me. He knew exactly what was coming, and yet he gave thanks, which shows the absolute depth of his love for us. Because the brokenness Jesus experienced on the cross was horrible and it was horrifying, beyond what we can begin to imagine. Yet Jesus chose to endure it because he could see beyond it. Our rescue from brokenness, our redemption. And so for that joy set before him, Jesus gave thanks. And if he could give thanks for what would happen on Good Friday and what he could see beyond it, then so can we. And so I think that's where we really need to sit today on Good Friday, to not look beyond the cross yet, but to take it all in. The horror of it and the love that was even greater. So I'll see you next week when we're on the other side of the empty tomb. But for today, on this dark but beautiful Good Friday, this Shabbat, I wish you a day of resting in the reality that the bread of abundant life, the Messiah, chose to be broken, and that he blessed that brokenness even before it happened, so that we could be made whole. So I wish you Shabbat Shalom, rest and peace to you in him.